The lighthouse was just a code name for a building. So, like I was saying, at the center of the fighting, as the Germans were edging their way ever closer to the Volga, capturing the city building by building, block by block, street by street, by the time you get to the lighthouse, this the Soviet defense was in very small, isolated pockets, no more than 200 meters deep until you get to the Volga. They're hanging on by the skin of their teeth. Germans owned probably or occupied probably about at least 90% of the city. Uh, the lighthouse found itself in no man's land. And it was just a large apartment block that had originally been built for the party elite and for technicians and engineers who worked in the factory district to the north. If you were somebody, you'd want to live in this building because it had the latest technology. It had hot and cold running water, gas mains, electricity, very comfortable living compared to what you normally get. And fundamentally, it was built with reinforced girders. So despite all the carnage that was going on around it, and there were several buildings very much in the same architectural design as this building, these were the smashed out hulks that were dotted around the center of the city that both sides were fighting for because they could turn them into mini fortresses. So this building, called the Lighthouse, was in the center between the lines, and it was codenamed the Lighthouse by the Russians because you're at the top of this four-story building. It gives you a perfect view, 360-degree view, 5 kilometers in any direction. You'll get to see what the enemy's doing. The Germans want it because for the exact same reason. They can see where the Russians are now sending reinforcements across the Volga to these these final lines that they're trying to capture. The
So
Germans were
the
caught unawares by a storm group, and the Russians captured it, gave it the code name the Lighthouse, and that's where this legend begins that I talk about in my book that Soviets have been believing for the last 80 years, which my research proved, well, it's more propaganda than truth.
so the Lighthouse of Stalingrad, which also is referred to as Pavlov's house,
Exactly, yeah.
correct?
That's the legend. Is Pavlov's house?
Yeah. So the types of fighting Russian troops are there is it are there snipers in the windows? Are there machine guns set up? What kind of resistance are people in this building putting up against the Germans? And then how are the
Yeah.
Germans trying to overcome them in this building?
Well, yeah. I mean, both sides were very adept. I mean, the Germans were just as good at sneaking into buildings, sneaking into houses, and then turning them into fortresses and fighting for them and maximizing the losses to the other side. Soviets and the Germans were exactly the same. It was the same kind of fighting, really. But this kind of thing, the legend of Pavlov's house is basically it's a metaphor, and the way it was portrayed during the fighting itself, because that's where the legend comes from, is is a metaphor for how the Soviets were seeing their troops heroically fighting and sacrificing themselves to hold Stalin's city. So you're mentioning snipers. So there's a lot of legends and almost psychological terror tactics that the Soviets were putting on the Germans via their own propaganda and media was it's not safe to be around the city during the daytime if you're Germans because we've got all these incredible Soviet snipers that are just going to pick you off. People like Vasily Zaitsev, which is the famous film with Jude Law, Enemy at the Gates. He's Vasily Zaitsev, and he's taking out hundreds of Germans during the daytime. But then Pavlov's house was part of this campaign as well. So he was a sergeant and a leader of a storm group, and the storm group was roughly about 4 to 6 people. That this is the commanding officer general of the 62nd Army, Chukov, wanted to have happen. It was his way of guerrilla tactics to take this new fight to the Germans, and they were armed to the teeth, submachine guns, bayonets, grenades. And it was his job to go out into no man's land to see if there were any Germans in the house because they knew there were some there. And the legend that Soviet school children have been taught for decades is they got to the house, they drove out or killed the Germans that were occupying the house. They then fortified it and they were reinforced with their own platoon who came out to see them. So you're talking about another 20 to 30 men. And the legend goes that all these men came from all 15 republics of the Soviet Union. So the whole Soviet Union is represented in this house. And then they proceeded to hold off in a very kind of Alamo style, hugely overwhelming number of German forces that were trying to take this house for the reason I gave you, that it was strategically important. And the propaganda and the story that you can buy in a bookshop, if you're in Moscow now, you could buy this story, is, they fought off the basically the strength of a German division. And you talk about thousands of men, tanks, armored cars, airstrikes, etc., etc. And Pavlov led the fight to hold this for 58 days. Famously, that's what they call it. It was a 58-day siege. When in effect, if you check the records, they actually occupied this building for the rest of the battle. So it's well over 100 days. It's only called 58-day siege because that's when Pavlov was injured, wounded in battle, and he was shipped out. And that actually did happen.